Thank you to everybody for joining. It's 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Sarah Polano. I am a Senior Account Manager with Getting Hired, and I will be your moderator for today's session, Accommodation Tips to Support Job Seekers with Epilepsy, Their Caregivers, and Spouses in the Workforce, presented by Tom Buckley, Sandra Lynch-Irvin, and Sharan Martin from Epilepsy Foundation. A couple housekeeping items. Today's session is scheduled for 1 hour from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, though I anticipate that it will not take the full hour. We are recording the session and will send a link to that recording instead of sending out the presentation deck. Feel free to ask any questions or provide comments through the chat box at any time. There should be a drop-down option for the chat box at the top of your screen, and those questions will come directly to me. We will follow up with you after the webinar if we weren't able to answer your questions at the end of the presentation. Everyone's line is automatically placed on mute, so again, please feel free to ask any questions that you have through the chat box, and live captioning is being provided. I will send the link to this through the chat box. If you have any other questions, please let me know, but at this time, I will turn it over to Epilepsy Foundation.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharan Martin, and on behalf of the Epilepsy Foundation and my colleagues and I would like to thank you for joining us today for our presentation, Accommodation Tips to Support Job Seekers with Epilepsy, Their Caregivers, and Spouses in the Workforce. November is Epilepsy Awareness Month, and we are very excited to share with you information on the spectrum of epilepsy and misperceptions about seizures, the top accommodations for epilepsy in the workplace, including the low cost for employers and tips to attract, hire, and drive inclusion of individuals with epilepsy in your workplace. So what is epilepsy? Let's start at the beginning and review what the terms seizures and epilepsy mean. A seizure is a symptom of a disturbance in the electrical activity of the brain. It's a symptom of another problem. The term epilepsy is used to describe a disease of the brain. So epilepsy is characterized by the tendency to have recurrent, unprovoked seizures. So a few of these terms may need clarification. Recurrent means that a person has had 2 or more seizures and is likely to have more. If a person has had only 1 seizure and there is no clear indication or risk for another, the person would likely not be diagnosed with epilepsy yet. However, once the person has had a second seizure, the term epilepsy would apply. So the definition of epilepsy has been clarified in recent years by the International League Against Epilepsy. 2 or more unprovoked seizures more than 1 day apart is a typical definition. However, sometimes the risk of having another seizure is high enough to warrant diagnosing epilepsy and then starting seizure medications after the first seizure. High risk is assumed when there is a greater than 60% chance of a person having another seizure. And the term epilepsy and seizure disorder are used interchangeably. So it's also extremely important that we use the correct terminology when talking about a person with epilepsy. So for example, we no longer use the term epileptic, but instead we use the term or the phrase person with epilepsy. We no longer use terms such as fits and spells to describe a seizure. We would just use the term seizure. So there are many prevalent misconceptions about epilepsy. So here are just some of the facts that you really should know. Epilepsy is much more common than you think. The prevalence of epilepsy, or how many people have epilepsy in any given year or point in time, is about 3.4 million. This number is derived from data from the CDC on surveys that they gave to individuals who self-reported who are having active epilepsy. So more recent data is giving higher numbers, but this includes people with a history of epilepsy or active epilepsy. I think one of the most important statistics that really should stick out is that 1 in 26 people will develop epilepsy during their lifetime. So it's important to understand the difference between provoked and unprovoked seizures. So provoked means that the seizures were caused by another health problem, and when that health problem is treated, the person is no longer susceptible to recurring seizures or epilepsy. However, keep in mind that people may have seizures that are provoked acutely, they go away, but then they might develop unprovoked seizures at a later date. So there are various factors that may provoke seizures. Sometimes it could be a high fever, maybe drug use, maybe a head injury, dehydration, or hyperhydration. Sometimes complication from diabetes or pregnancy or other acute medical illnesses can provoke a seizure. For 70% of people with epilepsy, the cause is unknown, while the remaining 30% have common identifiable causes, such as brain injury at birth, maybe a past injury or trauma or stroke, infections of the brain, such as meningitis. So you have different factors that can impact people with seizures. So sometimes the seizures themselves or medication and the side effects of those medications, or sometimes underlying brain abnormalities can all impact how a person with epilepsy, how they learn, their behavior, and their self-concept, just to name a few. And we do have various seizure triggers. So a person's environment or their activities may need to be modified to reduce exposure to situations that can trigger a seizure. So the number one reason why seizures are triggered would be missed or late medication, sometimes lack of sleep or fatigue or stress or anxiety or illness. There's a host of different triggers that can trigger a person's seizure. So sometimes you want to be able to modify that person's situation, and also a safety evaluation can help determine any changes that might need to be made. Sometimes you need to consider flashing lights that occur in movies or television or even computer screens, all of which can possibly trigger a seizure in a person. So this particular slide really touches on some of the misperceptions associated with seizures. So most importantly, most seizures are not medical emergencies. Oftentimes when a person is having a seizure, they're not aware that the seizure is even taking place, and they oftentimes do not remember what happened after the seizure is over. Epilepsy is not contagious, but it definitely is a medical illness, just like asthma or diabetes. It is rare for a person to die during a seizure, but most importantly, a person cannot swallow his or her tongue during a seizure. And I know that is one misperception that has been very long-standing. So you never want to put anything in the mouth of a person when they're having an active seizure. So seizures can be classified as a generalized seizure, focal seizure, or sometimes the onset is unknown. So generalized seizures begin in both sides of the brain, and the loss of consciousness is assumed. With a focal seizure, it begins in one part or one side of the brain. Consciousness may or may not be affected, and then sometimes the focal seizure can spread to a generalized seizure. So the focal seizure, whether it's aware and unaware, are the most common types of seizures, and they account for nearly 3 out of 4 seizures that occur. So with generalized seizures, sometimes their motor skills might be affected, and you will see the most common type that most people recognize when someone is having a seizure would be what we call a tonic-clonic seizure. It's the stiffening of the body. It's when the body has jerky movement. It's really clear that someone is having a seizure, and that's the one that most people think about when they think about having a seizure. Sometimes the motor skills are not affected. It might like the person is daydreaming, and we call that an absence seizure. And then, of course, on the other side, you have the focal seizures. They're based on whether the person's conscious or not, whether there's movement or not. So there's a lot of different classifications, but we just want to make you aware of what they are. So sometimes the seizure may appear, someone will suddenly cry out and they will fall. We talked about the stiffening of limbs, convulsive movements. The person might be confused or tired or have a headache afterwards. That is known as a generalized tonic-clonic seizure or convulsion. Or, just like I said, the seizure can be blank staring or chewing, other repetitive movements, unable to talk or incoherent speech. That is known as a focal seizure with impaired awareness. Sometimes a focal onset seizure might be mistaken for the person appearing drunk or having used illegal drugs or having some signs of mental illness or even a medical condition like a stroke or a diabetic reaction. Those symptoms actually also are focal onset seizures, and so sometimes they are mistaken. I think I jumped. And a person having a focal seizure with impaired awareness, they are not going to be, just like the title of the seizure indicates, they're not going to be aware of their surroundings. They're not going to be able to control their body movements. They're not going to be able to answer any questions. That's what's really important to consider. Some individuals who are having seizures know that the seizure is about to happen, and that's called it's called an aura. So it's a definite sign that the seizure is about to occur. It may include an odd taste or smell, or a feeling of fear, or even a tingling sensation. So this slide reviews very basic seizure first aid for all seizure types that we call care and comfort. Again, most seizures are not medical emergencies, and care and comfort measures are all that is needed. So it's really important that you stay with the person and you start timing the seizure. You remain calm and you check for medical ID. Keep the person safe. Move or guide away from harmful objects. Turn the person onto their side if they are not awake and aware. Don't block the airway. Put something small and soft under the head. Loosen any tight clothes around their neck. Also, again, do not put anything in their mouth. Don't give the person water, pills, or food until the person is awake. Absolutely do not restrain them. Stay with them until they are awake and alert after the seizure. Most seizures will end in a few minutes. So even though we said that most seizures are not medical emergencies and do not require transport to an emergency room, it is important to note when you should call 911. If the seizure lasts longer than 5 minutes, if the person's having repeated seizures, if the person's having difficulty breathing, if the seizure occurs in the water, if the person is injured, pregnant, or sick, if the person does not return to their usual state, and if it's their first time having a seizure. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tom Buckley, who is going to go over accommodations for epilepsy in the workplace.
Hey, Sharon, I just wanted to chime in real quick just before we transition to the next section and call out a couple items and just add on to some of that great content you presented and get your opinion on something. So in addition to all these seizure first aid tips, one other thing that I wanted to advise, and this is just from personal experience, so for me, for those of you on the line who don't know me, I have a family member who has epilepsy, so I'm a caregiver to that family member, and it's a non-apparent disability. So again, one of the reasons why we are talking about epilepsy is, yes, it is Epilepsy Awareness Month, but it's also a non-apparent disability. And knowing that over 70% of people have non-apparent disabilities, it's something that we wanted to provide more education on, because unless someone discloses this, you may never know this about the person. And it's also what we call changing disability status, where someone could go years without having a seizure, and so they may not identify as having a disability during that time. They may not need medication. They may not need any other accommodations. But in the case of my family member, they had a seizure a number of months ago, and when that happened, they needed a number of accommodations once they went back into the workplace and needed to know that they were walking back into an inclusive culture where they could tell their manager, they could tell their coworkers what happened and comfortably ask for those accommodations in order to continue their job, but make some adjustments like carpooling to work with people, not having to drive for a couple months, go to more doctor's appointments, things like that. So with all that being said, one of the changes that my family member made, or pieces of education, was picking 2 to 3 colleagues in the office that they work with most closely and that they were around the most often, and just educated them on Seizure First Aid as well. So in the event that they had a seizure in the office or in the workplace, it wouldn't be a shock of, we don't know what to do, we don't feel comfortable, we're afraid to touch you, but we now feel educated and we know what to do in this situation to treat it properly. So I just wanted your opinion, Sharan and team, if that's something else that you would advise, just educating those around you, or if there are any other tips just maybe from your personal experiences that you would like to share as well.
Well, thank you, Sarah. My name is Tom Buckley. I'm the Director of Information Referral. And actually, we're going to talk about some of those accommodations and some of the things that you can share in the workplace. Because really, when we're looking at the workplace, we have some key areas that we want to be very mindful of. And those include safety. I know that a lot of employers are worried about their company liability, as well as their employee performance. And adverse customer reactions is related to that. But we do know that from some of the research, time lost due to seizures is really only about an hour for every 1,000 hours worked. And that was a little bit of an older survey that was conducted a few years ago. But we're finding that as accommodations are there, we can see that employees are just with epilepsy are just as productive as any other person in there. They also found in some of them that accidents caused by coughing, sneezing, paper cuts, and things like that are just as frequent as any other medical condition with that. So bottom line is that many people with seizures really don't present any real job-relevant concerns. There are considerations where there's safety-sensitive jobs, and we will talk about that a little bit. But because people are afraid of getting fired, they may not necessarily disclose the fact that they have epilepsy or seizures, mostly because of the stigma or the fear of job loss, specifically in certain areas such as safety-sensitive like law enforcement, fire, medical-related positions. Many also don't disclose until after the job offer, again, because they're afraid they may not be hired. And employers that require drug testing, sometimes the AEDs, or the anti-epileptic drugs, so the drug treatments, can be misinterpreted. Some of them are scheduled drugs that do require certain controls. So we do want to share with you that Title I of the ADA, which was done in 1990, does make it unlawful for an employer to discriminate against a qualified applicant or employee with a disability. It also applies to family members that are caregivers when it comes to the Family Medical Leave Act, that if you have a family member that you have to take care of, there are certain protections involved with that. The ADA does only apply to private employers with 15 or more employees and all state and local government employers. The Title I of the ADA is enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And most people that may have a complaint, they typically have 180 days to file a complaint against a private employer, but they only have 45 days to file a complaint against a federal employer. Some states also have a slightly different ruling. I believe California, Wisconsin, or a couple others where you get a little bit more time, and that state handles the entire process for you. So you do want to check with your own state rules as to what's applicable. In 2008, the Act was amended. It clarifies that people with epilepsy are absolutely covered under the ADA and protected from discrimination. The ruling was basically that epilepsy substantially limits neurological function and that mitigating measures such as the use of medication should not be considered whether assessing an individual as having a disability or not. There was some Supreme Court rulings that said it really didn't create a plausible disability, but the ADA ruled that even though epilepsy wasn't something that was faced ongoing for some people. So an individual might have a seizure once a month or once every a couple months. They still qualified as being under the ADA and qualified as having a disability, even though it wasn't ongoing. All they had to do was show that there was a record of an impairment, that it substantially limited one or more major life activities, and that, and that pretty much all neurological functions were covered under that disability rule for that. But keeping that in mind, we know that even with epilepsy and some of the neurological impairment, that people with epilepsy have been successfully employed in a variety of jobs. You know, several of them considered high risk to include police officer, firefighter, welder, butcher, construction worker, so on. And that one challenge is that epilepsy is a high variable disorder, so it's hard to generalize it. So the ADA requires us to look at everybody as an individual. And what they're really recommending that we do is review any job-related risks. You know, what changes can be made to improve safety, not just for the person with epilepsy, but for others in general as well, can be considered. They also suggest talking and telling your coworkers about epilepsy and seizure first aid, just as Sarah mentioned. You know, what is it that you can do to educate the people around you? You know, is it putting up a seizure first aid poster? Is it holding a small training at your job so that everybody knows what to do? If climbing is involved, the recommendation is to climb only as high as you can safely fall, whether that's a step or two. If you have concrete floors, they recommend getting protection or padding. I know with our new Seizures and Safety brochure we published last year, we recommend even just extra padding in a workspace, because a lot of workspaces have carpeting, but there's no padding involved. So it's really just kind of a thin carpet layer over a concrete floor. Are safety harnesses required, or would be using a safety harness be just added extra safety that's involved for somebody with seizures? If they have to work around machinery, are there additional features? Are there the shutoffs? Are they easy to get to? Are there extra safety guards, or could extra safety guards be put in? One other thing that's very important, especially with some people, stress and loss of sleep can be triggers for them. So keeping consistent work hours. Or if they do have to have work hours, getting a reasonable break in there so that they're able to recover and re-energize, so that lack of sleep and stress isn't a trigger for them. If they're sensitive to flashing lights, limiting exposure as much as possible. Now, we hear all the time about the flashing lights from the fire alarms. They should know that most of those are below the 5 megahertz range, which was recommended by the National Fire Protection Agency, and they're not very likely to trigger seizures, but there is a small percent of the population that are very sensitive to flashing lights, and that may still be a trigger for them. The recommendations are dark glasses. We're seeing a lot of chatter right now in the network about the blue lenses. The Zeiss lenses that are available over in Australia are still being tested, but wearing those sometimes reduces people's risk for photosensitive seizures to occur from the flashing light. But when we also talked a little bit about stress, and I'm going to let Sandra talk a little bit more about that and the wellness component for it.
Thank you, Tom and Sharon. This is a perfect segue into talking about wellness in the workplace. The Epilepsy Foundation's Wellness Institute mission believes that everyone, including people with various types of epilepsy and associated chronic conditions, deserves to live a full and productive life to the best of their abilities. It's also my belief raising awareness about healthy behaviors and promoting evidence-based programs will allow us to continue to keep a balance in the things that we do. So one of the things that is important in the process of stress is knowing the importance of balance, both emotional and physical. So the Wellness Institute decided to engage in an emotional health using a holistic approach which highlights the 8 life dimensions of wellness, which you'll see on the wellness wheel. So those dimensions are included on the wheel. What I'm going to focus on today is stress management and how we can look at stress management in terms of wellness in the workplace. While each of these dimensions of life can stand alone, they are all interconnected. As one dimension improves or is challenged, so are the others. So I hope that makes sense. So today I'll highlight the life dimension of stress management. Managing stress is a common thread which we find occurs through all 8 life dimensions. We know as employers and employees and caregivers that stress can come to the workplace with us, and stress can also leave the workplace with us. Think about this. Think about a scenario where stress followed you to work. Has that ever happened to you? However, let's put a pin right there for a minute and think about this question. What is stress? In general, stress is a way of responding to any change in life, especially if it's related to a demand or threat. It can come from environmental, it can come from physical or emotional triggers. Everyone, people living with epilepsy, family, friends, and other caregivers, feel stress at different times. Stress is a normal part of our life and is often associated with a busy schedule, too much on our plate, major life changes, getting a new relocation, getting married, maybe even a new epilepsy diagnosis or other health challenges. So what role does it play in your life? Stress can be good and stress can be bad. Stress is exciting during positive events like the birth of a child or a job promotion. It creates a level of energy for meeting challenges. However, stress can be debilitating. So as we talk about stress and persons living with epilepsy, the question often asked is, can stress cause seizures? Well, some recent reviews suggest that stress is the most frequently reported seizure trigger. Therefore, seizures may be more likely to happen at times of stress. It is not known why stress can cause a seizure because it could be the stress itself or it could be the person's reaction to the stress. Think about a time when you had a stressful moment and how your body reacted to the stress. Your brain sets off an alarm. This alarm to release hormones, it travels through your body to protect your heart rate and your blood pressure. So at this point, you experience a surge of energy, which prepares your body to move into action and think faster and easier to problem solve and strategize your next move. If you have ever been frightened by a barking dog or had a major project you were working on and the deadline was getting close, you probably experienced some stress. While we all may have some problems remembering certain things due to overload, people with epilepsy commonly report having problems with their thinking and memory. Some examples are forgetting appointments, can't remember things in their long-term memory, but they can remember things in their short-term memory. That's reversed, actually. They cannot remember things in their long-term. They can, and they cannot in their short-term, and have some difficulty concentrating and paying attention. Any of these things can affect people living with epilepsy, both personally and professionally. So memory difficulties can have such a tremendous impact on people living with epilepsy that it may hinder their functioning at work, in school, and at home. However, the good news is persons living with epilepsy are gainfully employed in the workplace. So I'd like you to visit epilepsy.com for more information and resources about stress, emotional health, and caregivers. Now I will turn over to Tom, who will share information on tips for success in supporting job seekers and employees with epilepsy.
Great, thank you, Sandra. So we've talked a whole lot about different things here. The stress and triggers, what are seizures, the first aid. And we have an employee who wants to come in and get a job. What are accommodations when somebody asks for them? Well, according to the ADA, employers are required to provide a reasonable accommodation for employees who fall under the ADA definition unless there's an undue hardship. The number one question we get asked is, what is an undue hardship? And unfortunately, we really don't have an answer for that that's global for everyone. We know the ADA only covers organizations with 15 or more employees. But what do they consider an undue hardship? So one of the examples that I'm aware of is an individual is required to go out and do site visits. They get mileage reimbursement as a part of their job because they use their personal vehicle, and they have a seizure, and they're not allowed to drive for 6 months. In some states, it's 3 months. Some states, it's 6 months. Sometimes it requires a doctor's clearance. But during that time, they're not able to drive. What would be a reasonable accommodation in that case? Sometimes that might be maybe instead of doing mileage reimbursement, they allow them a transportation fund, to use public transportation, Lyft, Uber, taxi, local transportation services. Maybe it's a little additional travel time. So some of the Job Accommodation Network really kind of estimated that 56% of the accommodations really had no cost to them. It was just a matter of modifying the position or some kind of role in the position to make it still work. Those that did have a cost usually fell around $600 a year, so that was an annual cost. If there was a one-time equipment purchase, sometimes with individuals who have a physical disability, the cost was included in that estimated number. But it could be something simple like adjusted hours. Maybe they need to come in an hour later because they have to use public transportation that's not available, or maybe they can catch a ride with a coworker. Maybe they need a little extra time to complete a task. As Sandra said, maybe memory retention is a challenge, or a little more time to process that. Staying away from certain triggers like the lighting, heat, cold, loud noises, things at work. Some cases, maybe it's as simple as teleworking if that's something that's an option at your organization. Maybe, the requirement is they're be on board 6 or 9 months, and maybe you give an exemption that they need to come in for a while for training, but then they're able to work from home earlier. Other accommodations might be something as simple as little extended breaks to recover from a seizure, time off from a seizure, or a place for them, if you're in an open workspace, for them to have a recovery place. Adjusted leave for medical appointments. And that's not just for the person with the epilepsy or seizures. That might be for the family member or caregiver who has to take them to the doctor's appointment because they're not able to drive or have time to get them around to get their medications and the things that they need. In addition to that, additional leave might be necessary if somebody has to change medication. It takes time to adjust. Especially if somebody has started having seizures again. Our goal, that we promote with professionals and individuals with epilepsies is 0 seizures. And so that takes some time to get there, and it takes some work and constant communication with your healthcare providers. As employers, you can require an employee to give you a return to work date. So, not necessarily an open piece. The Family Medical Leave Act allows for up to 12 weeks, and some of that can be paid. But we really encourage the employee to be in contact constantly with the Human Resources Department or whoever to, keep in touch about what's going on and what the needs are. Other accommodations might be simple policy modification, the allowance of a service animal. Service animals provide a great benefit to people who have seizures and can alert others that a seizure might be happening. If they do have absence or loss of awareness of what's going on, they might wander into a hazardous area, and the service animal can help protect them from that. Again, we mentioned private areas for rest after a seizure. Other tasks, things that help with concentration and memory difficulties. Provide written or picture instructions. Retraining might be necessary, or repetitive training in order to help the memory retention occur. Regular refreshers, allowing the use of voice recordings, not only for them to take notes, but when you do a training or something, so that they have something to go back to. Other times it might be a little bit of job restructuring that's required, especially if there's a marginal job function that can happen. Avoiding climbing working heights. If it's not really required, is there somebody else that can do that? Driving is a key one that we get a lot of questions about, that somebody's license has been temporarily suspended or revoked because they've had a seizure and they're told they can no longer perform their job. But if driving is not a majority of the job task, is that really a requirement? Is it really an essential function? And there are other transportation means or accommodations that they might use. Again, back to traveling with a coworker, public transit, allowing a little extra time for travel. And then training, when bringing somebody new on board, can it be done in smaller segments or repetitive segments? So maybe be with one trainer and then another trainer and kind of go over it again. Telecommuting, again, another one out there. What tasks can be performed at home without causing significant difficulty or expense? Questions you have to ask yourself is, can they be adequately supervised? Is there any needed equipment or technology available at their house? Can work be split between the home and office? Are there other eligibility requirements, things that need to occur? Some of the environmental challenges or changes that you might see. Again, we mentioned this before, other safety devices around machinery, adding floor padding, extra head or eye protection, a rest area again, reassignment. If somebody has seizures, and let's say they work with a piece of machinery and it does become a safety sensitive issue, is there another position they can be moved into temporarily while they recover, while they change medication? They still may be required to perform those essential functions, but is there another position they can be moved into if necessary? So when does this become undue hardship? Well, again, this has to be determined on a case-by-case basis and what the accommodation request is. The employee does have to make the accommodation request to the employer. If it does seem like it's an undue hardship, the employer is responsible for trying to identify another accommodation that would not pose such a hardship. And the individual making the request can be given the option of paying for a portion of it. So a lot of times people think, oh, well, the employer has to pay 100%. But if it's not an easily done thing, we can ask the employee, there's a percentage of this cost that you may have to cover, especially if it's something unique out of that. Because most accommodation requests we already know don't cost that much and are now really not. One other thing that's good to know, the employers cannot disclose somebody's epilepsy to other staff members unless they're in a direct supervisory role. So if a coworker of the employee comes up and says, well, why did they get extra time off? You're technically not allowed to tell them. Only direct supervisors have a need to know, as well as maybe Human Resources Department where the accommodations requests are in there. It is up to the employee to disclose to the coworkers that they have epilepsy and what they need done at that point. We do have some resources for people out. We do have the Gene Carpenter Legal Defense Fund here at the Epilepsy Foundation to help talk with individuals who feel like they face some kind of discrimination with their employer. We'll also help connect them up with attorneys to kind of get a guidance or a bounce back, of ideas of whether or not there's an actual issue going on. And then the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission has a large question and answer area about epilepsy in the workplace, the ADA. At this point, let's see. If those are interested, there is additional resources for employers. It's working effectively with employees who have epilepsy. It's a study article done by Cornell University that kind of talks about what the costs are and how well that's benefit. And then the Job Accommodation Network is available to both potential employees and employers for guidance and maybe helping identify things that might be a reasonable accommodation or an undue hardship on that. Okay. And so, Sarah, I'm going to turn it over. It's time for some questions.
Sure, and thank you all so much for all the information. There were a couple things that I wanted to reiterate and just mention as well. So one of them being that I think one of my favorite statistics that Epilepsy Foundation has on its site is that 6 out of 10 is the number of people with epilepsy where the cause is unknown. So I think a lot of times we stereotype, and it could be from what we see in the media and how seizures and epilepsy is portrayed, but we might default to thinking about someone being in an environment or a room where there's a flashing light or a strobe light or something like that, and it immediately causes a seizure, and something more like a grand mal seizure or something where it is the stiffening of the body and a little bit more severe in symptoms like that. But from what I understand from today's presentation, that is not at all necessarily the case. And in the case of my family member as well, just speaking personally, they have epilepsy to where the cause is unknown. So a little bit scary for us, but at the same time making the point that some of those stereotypes are, in fact, stereotypes, and it isn't always going to be that type of seizure or the cause and trigger from, again, what we probably see in the media and see on shows. So I wanted to ask you all, are there any other myths or stereotypes that come to mind that you've heard of about people with epilepsy that you wanted to call out?
Probably, I think you're very correct on that, Sarah, is that one of the very common ones is that all flashing lights and stuff will trigger seizures, and we know that's actually very rare statistically. We know one piece that's a lot of that is that oftentimes people with epilepsy also have migraines and headaches, but it's more likely to actually trigger a migraine than it is actually a seizure or, on that side of it. Serene, was there any other myths that you wanted to add?
Sorry, probably just really to reiterate the earlier slide where I talked about the misperceptions that people have about epilepsy or about seizures. The one about putting something in someone's mouth, that to me is always the one that really stands out because people repeat that a lot. And as my slide indicated, you absolutely don't ever want to put anything in someone's mouth, including your fingers, because when someone is having a seizure and their jaw is really locked down, you do not want to your fingers to go up against someone's locked jaw during a seizure. Your fingers will loose every time, every time. And so you don't have to put anything in. The person's not going to swallow their tongue. It's not. It is just not physically possible to swallow your tongue. And so those are just some of the, I think, very common misperceptions that have been repeated over the years that we are always trying to correct people and make sure that they understand what are the dangers or what can happen when someone's having a seizure and just what is not absolutely going to happen at all.
And I would like to add on to that, too, is that seizures last different lengths of time for different people. So someone might have a seizure that only lasts a couple minutes, and their recovery time might only be a couple more minutes after that. Others, a seizure may last 3 or 4 minutes, but their recovery time might be 20 minutes or a little bit longer. And if someone does decide to share their seizures and their epilepsy with someone, it's also important to know how long is their typical time. You know, how long does a typical seizure last for them? How long is the typical recovery period for them? As we said in our Seizure First Aid, that it was to call 911 when it was beyond their normal recovery time, but it's a lot of times others don't know what that beyond recovery time is. So people can think that seizure, they go back to normal, some do not. Some have some periods of confusion afterwards, some wandering, and inability to focus for a period of time in their recovery time. So it's important to know that everyone is so different.
Absolutely. No, I think those are some great points to add on to that, so thank you for sharing. And I know we have a lot of people from talent acquisition or recruiters or hiring managers on the line, and also from HR on the line as well. So for you all especially, I wanted to reiterate some of the main points from this training. Yes, we wanted to just provide some education about epilepsy. Again, it being Epilepsy Awareness Month, there's a lot to know. There are a lot of stigmas and stereotypes like we just mentioned, and thinking that people with epilepsy have a lot of restrictions, because seeing somebody with a seizure, that can be so foreign to us. So it's just hard to imagine what potentially their abilities or their restrictions in life might be. But I think as we found out, they are functioning people just like everybody else. They most likely will know their own limitations, so remember that. That's probably a point that I have to remember about all people with disabilities. If someone needs an accommodation, they most likely already know what that accommodation is, and disclosure most often happens when somebody needs an accommodation. So if you're talking to a candidate, and this being a non-apparent disability as well, and you're trying to boost those disclosure rates or potential self-identification rates when you ask your employees, just know that this person could be at a point in their life where maybe they haven't had a seizure in a long time, so they haven't had to identify as having a disability, or they're choosing not to at this time. It doesn't mean that that inclusive culture and knowing that people are educated and have seizure first aid awareness is any less important to them. Or they could be a caregiver like myself, to where, exactly as Tom explained, I did need to request accommodations like a flexible work schedule in order to provide transportation to my family member when they had a seizure. But wanted to reiterate that. So if the disclosure doesn't happen in this case, those might be some reasons why it's not happening. But don't want it to be discouraging and for you to think that, okay, now that I know this, this knowledge will make people disclose more. What will, in fact, help to increase disclosure rates and make people feel more comfortable and really start to change that internal workplace is talking about this. So that's an action item that I would give everybody on the line, is go back to your teams and share with them that you attended this event. Or for anybody else that might be on social media, share on your company's social media handles that you attended this live training, that you are invested in Epilepsy Awareness Month and the inclusion of all people with disabilities, and spark that conversation. Because when you start to talk about it, and you may have a personal tie or connection to epilepsy as well, when you share that, somebody else may be prompted to share their story as well. And now it's starting to create those conversations and that feeling of inclusion within the workplace, and increase those disclosure rates. So that would be one of my action items to everybody on the presentation today, and then share Seizure First Aid with somebody else as well, because again, 1 in 26 can develop in their lifetime, which is a much larger number than I was aware of. But Tom, Sharon, Sandra, is there anything else? Oh, excuse me, there was one question from somebody. So the term hyperhydration was used when describing triggers for epileptic seizures. Can you tell us what exactly that means again?
Can you hear us? Okay.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. So yeah, overhydrating, drinking too much water. It actually can, long-term effects are not as good as people think. Overhydration, I think they recommend about 8 to 12 ounce glasses a day, but people tend to drink a lot more than that. And that actually can be bad for your system sometimes, especially with medications. So.
Great, thank you. And I know we do have some time. If anybody else has a question, please feel free to enter it through the chat box. And also know that you can reach out to your dedicated account manager with Getting Hired for any additional questions as well. We'll be happy to follow up with you. While I just give everybody a couple seconds, Sharon, Tom, Sandra, is there anything else that you wanted to add as just a last recap? There's a lot of great information shared. So anything else you wanted to summarize?
Sure. You had talked about the importance of people being aware and everything. And there were a lot of employers do CPR training and other kind of trainings and first aid training. We encourage you to actually get an epilepsy training and have your local office come in and do seizure recognition and first aid. The Epilepsy Foundation does offer seizure first aid posters that can be posted in the workplace. When employees coming in see that, they see that you're already aware of epilepsy and you're familiar with it at least some degree, they might be more comfortable disclosing as well. We also are encouraging people with epilepsy to create seizure response plans. We did a new released format of that last year that can be shared with HR or maybe a coworker, whatever they choose, to what to do if they do have a seizure. Because I know one of our big challenges that we see is that places are afraid of rescue medications now for people that have cluster seizures or seizures back-to-back. And I know from working with people for years, and I also have a medical background working in emergency medicine, is people don't help because they're afraid. They don't know what to do. And getting the training and becoming familiar with seizure first aid or any kind of first aid and the seizure response plan kind of helps reduce that fear so that somebody will step in and help. So it increases the comfort level.
That's a great tip. Thank you so much for sharing that, Tom. And at this time, we don't have any additional questions, so I'm happy to give everybody some time back to their day. Again, Tom, Saran, Sandra, I wanted to thank you again for all of the great information today, for the time for sharing this presentation, and for everybody on the line as well. I hope you all learned something and have a new piece of information or a tip or best practice to bring back to your team. If you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to us directly, but otherwise have a wonderful rest of your day.